immigration laws. In this lesson, we're going to look at the history of immigration laws and the impact it's had on immigrants and other Americans. So our objective today is we're going to list and evaluate treatment of immigrants through the restrictive legislation against foreigners. So that's just a fancy way of saying we're going to look at laws and how they've affected immigrants. And you're going to notice as we go through that most of the laws had kind of a negative impact on immigrants and restricted them in different ways. Our essential questions are: how did our government treat immigrants throughout the 19th and 20th centuries? And did immigrants receive the same rights, responsibilities, and duties of Americans when they arrived? So we're going to see if when they got to this country, they got what they came for, the rights, duties, and responsibilities that we've been talking about for a few pods now. So let's just look at some examples of some immigration laws that have existed in U.S. history. In 1790, naturalization rules established a 2-year residency requirement for immigrants wanting to become U.S. citizens. That meant that if you wanted to become a U.S. citizen, you had to live here for a certain amount of time. In 1875, there was a kind of a more restrictive law. It said that no convicts or prostitutes were allowed to come into the country. In the 1880s and 1890s is when things started to get a little bit different. In 1882, for example, immigration from China was curtailed, meaning it was kind of stopped, and we'll get into that in a little bit. There also started to be laws about letting in people that were deemed to be lunatics or idiots, and this is what it says in these laws, or people that were unable to take care of themselves. You also had to pay a tax if you wanted to come into the country. Some other examples. In 1903, you could be not admitted based on your political beliefs. In 1907, if you had a physical or mental disability, you might not be let into the country. And in 1910, you're a criminal or you had some kind of disease, you might not be let into the country. So you see, all of these things evolved to try and stop certain types of people from coming into the country. The government gets involved in this as well. An example was in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. A lot of people in California didn't want Chinese immigrants coming into China or into California because they didn't want them to own property and they didn't want them to have certain types of jobs. Californians, the people that live there, for the most part, did not want the Chinese to be a part of their society. They had a lot of concerns with it. So Congress passed a law that limited the amount of Chinese immigrants sharply. So only a certain amount of Chinese immigrants were allowed to come into the country. Another example, in 1907, something called the Gentleman's Agreement. It was a deal reached between President Theodore Roosevelt and Japan that halted emigration of Japanese citizens to the U.S. almost completely. So you see two examples there of the government trying to stop certain types of people, Chinese and Japanese, from coming into the country. Another example was in 1917 with the Literacy Act. The Literacy Act was all about taking a test to see if you could read and speak and write English, and if you couldn't, you might be sent out of the country. They set it up specifically to try and stop Southern Europeans, Jewish people, Asians from coming into the country. There's a little bit of an exception on it for farm workers who were mostly Mexican because they needed that type of work. Some more examples. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 that made it so only a certain amount of people from each nationality could come into the country. So it was easier for people who were part of a nationality that already had a lot of people in the United States. For example, there was a lot of Irish people already in the United States in 1921. So if you're Irish, there was a better chance that you would get in. Somebody like Chinese or Japanese would have a much tougher time. National Origins Act, similar. It further reduced the amount of immigrants allowed in the country, attempting to restrict the amount of Southern and Eastern Europeans that immigrated as well as Asians. So the 1924 Immigration Act severely limits because, why were they doing this? Why were they trying to stop certain types of people or immigrants in general from coming into the country? There was a feeling of racism that the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons, which are people who are Caucasian from Northwest Europe. People thought that immigrants were causing the lowering of wages, that immigrants were taking jobs that Americans might want, and they were doing it for cheaper, so that was making how much people were getting paid lower. People were afraid that immigrants weren't assimilating to society. That means immigrants were coming here, but not being quote-unquote American. People felt that it might be a threat to national identity and unity because everyone was so different and kind of split up into their own little groups. So all of these limitations are sometimes because of fear of new people and different types of people and different types of ideas and cultures coming into the country, but also because people were afraid of the impact it would have on the American economy. So if you look at this little chart, it has the number of people who've come into the United States legally, not illegally, legally, for each decade. And you can see that each decade it's gone up. In the 1950s, 2.5 million legal immigrants came into the United States. In the 1990s, 9.1 million people came into the United States as legal immigrants, and that was the biggest decade. So you can see it's kind of always on the rise. So once immigrants get here, what is their impact? The first one's the melting pot, which we've talked about before. That just means that when you have a whole lot of people come into a country, they all kind of blend together, and they start to share ideas, and you see a country that has all kinds of different people and all kinds of different cultures, and they all kind of mix together just like a melting pot. Another big impact was urbanization. Urbanization just means cities getting bigger and more people living in cities closer together. Most immigrants tended to live in cities in the north and west of the country. They stayed there because for the most part it was the only place they could find a job. When they come in there, they create their own little neighborhoods. Remember, we call those ghettos. Another impact of new immigration was the Industrial Revolution. All these people come to this country and they all got to work. They all have to have a job. And people know that they're kind of desperate for a job and that they'll probably work for just about anything. So people that own factories and mills and businesses, they hire immigrants into those jobs and don't really pay them very much. And it leads to a boom in American industry. America gets very rich and powerful during this time period, and a big reason for that is immigrants. Another impact is immigrant discontent. Obviously, immigrants weren't very happy with how they were being treated in the United States. And they did different things in reaction to that. Not all immigrants, but some. If they weren't happy with their situations, sometimes people would just continue to live their lives. But a lot of people would try and join revolutionary groups, groups that would try to change things, maybe even with violence. And a lot of them start to resort to organized crime. There was a lot of contributions by immigrants other than boosting the American economy. Chinese immigrants worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, which was the first railroad that connected the East Coast to the West Coast, and again led to the increase in American economic power. A lot of them worked in textile and steel mills in the Northeast, so they were doing things and working in areas that helped provide things that Americans needed. They made things like clothing, and they worked in coal mines as well. So they worked in jobs where they were creating things that everybody needs, like clothes and steel and coal to power things. Probably their most obvious impact is just how big cities got when they all came to America. They all needed a place to live, so it makes cities much, much bigger. Remember, they settled in major cities because of jobs, and they lived in those crowded things we called tenements, which is just a different word for apartment, in some of the big cities across the country. So how did that impact cities and just us today? Well, you saw the limitations on immigration. But the thing you should definitely remember from this lesson is the impact that immigrants had. and how their labor and their hard work contributed to a lot of things in the United States. They also contributed to awareness, meaning that they made people realize that other things were needed in cities if the cities were going to be functional. There's things that we take for granted today. For example, sewage treatment. You can go to the bathroom and you can flush a toilet and it goes away, and that seems like a very obvious thing. But this time period, that did not exist. There wasn't sewage treatment, and sometimes there'd just be anything you could think of just running through the streets. This time period helps people realize that things like proper sewage are needed if cities are going to be functional. Another thing is water. Not every house or apartment had access to water, believe it or not. So this made people realize that that needed to happen. Also, with the growth of people living in cities, they realized that transportation needed to be easier. So things like subways and trolleys started to come about during this time period. For those of you that live in cities, or if you've ever been to a city, next time you're in one or you're walking around, just think about the way that that city functions and the things that make that city be able to exist on a daily basis. A lot of that stuff was impacted by immigrants. Them being in this country made people realize that if cities were going to be functional, there were certain things that needed to be done, like the things that we talked about on this slide. Alright, that's it for this lesson. Be sure to answer the questions that are underneath of this video. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. If not, good luck.